You have been sold a postcard fantasy. We are taught that Europe, with its accumulated centuries of cobblestones and cathedrals, possesses a cultural gravity immune to decay. That places like Florence or Prague are permanent fixtures at the top of the world's imagination, drawing inescapable rivers of bodies that will flow forever. But if you look past the gloss of the tourism board press releases, a single, inconvenient fact emerges: the machine is breaking down. In 2024, the travel industry celebrated record numbers across the continent. Yet a forensic observation of specific iconic cities reveals a startling process of hollowing out. We are witnessing not an evolution, but a quiet, structural evaporation of value. Take a walk in Florence, not near the Duomo, where the day trippers from Rome and cruise ships in Livorno create the illusion of density, but in the Oltrarno. Talk to the family-owned hotel operators, or the restaurant owners who have spent 3 generations on the south side of the Arno. They will tell you that the visitors are no longer the same. The city that built its identity on unparalleled cultural magnetism is rapidly becoming a checkbox on a phone screen, a monument to be quickly documented and abandoned before dinner. The data confirms the slow fade that the mainstream media is ignoring. Between 2015 and 2023, the average length of stay in Florence dropped from 3.2 nights to under 2.1. Crucially, the revenue per available room, the heartbeat of any hospitality economy, has lagged behind inflation for 4 consecutive years in the historic center. A quiet transformation is underway, one that the travel world refuses to name because it points to a systemic fragility. Empires do not always collapse with a bang. They fall through subtle arithmetic shifts, a pattern that has repeated across history, from Rome to Constantinople, and is visible now in Europe's most beloved urban cores. It starts with the smart money moving elsewhere, followed by a dilution of the experience until only a generic husk remains. This is not a temporary economic dip. It is a profound change in how the world engages with Europe's past, and this is only the beginning of what the hollowing out reveals. The machine that once produced wealth is now producing stagnation. We were told that the hyper-monetization of European history was a sustainable strategy for local economies, an endless source of capital, requiring nothing more than preservation. But the mechanism of heritage tourism contains a fundamental flaw. It scales by consuming the very reality that made it valuable. In cities like Bruges and Dubrovnik, the relentless optimization for high-volume foot traffic has reached its logical conclusion. The infrastructure built to handle the peak crowds of 2019 is now operating against a reality that cannot support its overhead. The data from the Flemish hospitality sector reveals exactly how this calcification occurs. Between 2018 and 2024, overnight bookings in Bruges dropped by 22% when measured against adjusted national recovery baselines. This is not a failure of marketing, it is a structural rejection. When a destination becomes identical to its own digital cliché, it loses the capacity to attract the repeat visitors who historically formed its economic foundation. For a boutique hotel owner on the Diver Canal, this means consecutive sold-out weekends have completely disappeared since 2017, leaving a gap in the ledger that no single summer afternoon spike can bridge. Further south, along the Adriatic, the arithmetic is even more relentless. In Dubrovnik, where visitor numbers tripled during the peak of global media saturation, the high-spending consumer segment has quietly migrated away. Industry records from 2023 and 2024 indicate that luxury travel advisors have progressively removed the historic center from premium packages. The boutique hotels inside the limestone walls are now running at occupancy margins that assume 2019 saturation levels, but the reality is a thinner, more transient crowd. For the local guide who invested a decade into building a specialized business, the result is an empty calendar and a business model that is no longer solvent. Walk into the side streets of Edinburgh's Old Town or the lower corridors of Prague's tourist zone, and you see the physical evidence of this shift. In Edinburgh, a widely cited 2024 survey showed that satisfaction scores for the city center experience reached a 10-year low, driven entirely by crowding and hyperinflation. The short-term rental market absorbed so much of the residential housing stock that the historic core lost its permanent community. Today, traditional retail units stand empty or have been replaced by generic souvenir outlets selling low-grade imports. For the independent bookshop owner or the local artisan, It means paying a premium rent to look out at a street filled with people who spend nothing in the local economy in Lisbon's Alfama district. The transformation happened with a speed that shocked the regional housing board. A historic urban neighborhood was intelligently converted into a corridor of short-term accommodations and staged cultural shows within 8 years. By 2024, the Portuguese Tourism Authority recorded a decline in real-term average spending per visitor for the second consecutive year. The hyper-supply of rental properties began competing against itself, driving occupancy rates down in historically secure areas like Bairro Alto and Chiado. For a former property developer who built his portfolio on the city's initial renaissance, the reality is a market that burned through its 30-year life cycle in less than a decade. This is what happens when a living city is converted into a theme park. On the island of Santorini, a closed system of 76 square kilometers, the permanent resident population decreased by approximately 18% between 2010 and 2023. The young workforce required to run a premium service economy simply left for Athens or the mainland, leaving an aging population to manage a machine that has stripped the island of its civic life. In 2024, several of the most established luxury operators on the island quietly shortened their summer season by up to 3 weeks because they could no longer find the staff or provide the standard of experience that their rates demanded. We can look closely at a single point on the map to see exactly how this looks on the ground. In Prague's Holešovice neighborhood, a few miles outside the three-street tourist core, sits a small, traditional restaurant that managed to survive the transition from the old regime to the modern era. The owner, a man named Tomasz, whose family has operated hospitality businesses in the city since the 1990s, watches a neighborhood that is visually unchanged but economically hollowed out. 10 years ago, Tomasz notes, pointing to a half-empty dining room during what should be peak evening hours, we had a steady mix of locals and cultured international visitors who wanted to stay for a week, eat real food, and understand how we live. Today, the foreigners don't leave the old town. The ones who do are looking for a cheap beer before they head back to a short-term rental. The media says the numbers have recovered, but my ledger says the people who actually supported our culture have gone elsewhere. The decline of these spaces is not a series of isolated local failures or mismanaged marketing campaigns. It is a predictable trajectory that follows a structural pattern visible across economic history. When abundance replaces scarcity, the premium value vanishes and the system begins to consume itself from within. And as these destination models fail to adapt, the desperate attempts by municipal governments to reverse the damage are only accelerating the next phase of the crisis. This is the stage where the decline becomes an active secret. We are faced with a jarring paradox. On the pavement, the hollowing out is entirely visible to anyone who looks closely, yet the official narrative remains a wall of unyielding optimism. The industry's survival depends on public confidence, which means the truth must be managed with extreme care. When Amsterdam launched its highly publicized campaign to discourage budget tourism, the move was framed internationally as an act of municipal strength, a progressive city reclaiming its borders. But the data from the subsequent years tells a much more complicated story. The targeted restrictions caused occupancy rates in secondary and tertiary neighborhoods to fall far more sharply than the municipal budget had anticipated, while the higher spending luxury cohort failed to arrive in the numbers required to balance the books. Amsterdam found itself caught in a trap of its own design, a city that attempted to cure over-tourism, only to confront the immediate economic crisis of the wrong kind of under-tourism. This creates a powerful chilling effect across the entire European hospitality sector. Behind closed doors, hotel associations and municipal authorities speak an entirely different language than the one found in their glossy press releases. Valletta, the 2018 European Capital of Culture designation, triggered millions of euros in private and public investment to restore Baroque architecture and build high-end boutique infrastructure. Today, the official line praises the permanent preservation of the city, but speaking off the record to operators in Malta reveals a deep anxiety. Outside of the peak summer weeks, occupancy has slumped to levels that make those massive capital investments fundamentally unviable. Yet, no one can say this out loud. To admit that the compounding growth model has failed would be to trigger a collapse in property valuations and a withdrawal of credit from the very banks that funded the boom. The silence extends to the data itself, which is routinely spun to hide structural decay. When a city center loses its permanent population, the loss is masked by counting transient foot traffic as engagement. In smaller, historically resilient cities like Ghent, which spent a decade positioning itself as the authentic living alternative to the preserved amber of Bruges, the vulnerability is even more acute. Ghent did everything right, avoiding the traps of hyper-monetization and maintaining its local civic life. Yet by 2024, the macroeconomic reality caught up with it anyway. A sharp decline in long-haul city breaks from North American and Australian markets, driven by unprecedented flight costs and unfavorable currency shifts, cut off the international oxygen that smaller destinations rely on. The micro-success was swallowed by a systemic contraction, but you will not find that admission in any regional tourism bulletin. When you zoom out from these individual urban cores, the broader implications for the European continent become unmistakable. This is not a story about a bad travel season, nor is it a minor logistical hurdle. It is a fundamental disruption of a system that has sustained the Western European economy for more than half a century. The assumption that European history is an infinite, non-depreciable asset that can be endlessly sold without consequence. When a city is thoroughly stripped of its residents, its local shops, and its organic culture, it undergoes an irreversible transformation. It ceases to be an active participant in the world's cultural evolution and becomes instead a static exhibition. And static exhibitions do not inspire the kind of deep recurring attachment that builds long-term economic stability. The capital that once flowed into these historic centers is already beginning to migrate toward emerging destinations in Southeast Asia, Japan, and Latin America, places where urban life is still organic, unpredictable, and unfranchised. The structural erosion is already deep within the foundations. The family-owned guest houses that survived world wars and currency collapses are quietly being sold to international investment funds that view historic real estate merely as an asset class to be managed through an automated yield algorithm. The local guides, the independent artisans, the small restorers who maintain the physical reality of these spaces are aging out. With no younger generation willing or able to take their place in a neighborhood they can no longer afford to live in, the cities that defined the modern concept of travel are discovering that history is not a renewable resource. A system built on the artificial scarcity of heritage is being systematically dismantled by the sheer abundance of modern travel options and the algorithmically driven distribution of human attention. The walls still stand, the cathedrals remain perfectly intact, and the limestone streets are polished to a mirror shine, but the spirit that made those stones matter has begun a long, quiet retreat. We are left looking at a landscape that is visually familiar but structurally hollowed out. The great irony of the modern empire of heritage tourism is that in its absolute determination to preserve the past for the world to see, it managed to ensure that there would be nothing left to experience. Which leaves us with a question that the travel industry is completely unprepared to answer. When the world finally finishes documenting these places for their screens, and the illusion of permanence fades, what happens to a continent that forgot how to build anything new?